are attending. Good, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for attending our public workshop today on the 2022 Ozone Plan. We have staff members and members of CARB attending via Zoom teleconference and Zoom for our participants as well. No in-person option for this meeting today. We will do our best to facilitate a smooth meeting with public participation. Before we begin then, I want to review some important guidelines and general instructions for our meeting. Particularly at the end, when it's time for the public comment portion, we do ask that you silence your cell phones and your desk phones to ensure that we do not hear any feedback that can interrupt the meeting. Only district and California Air Resources Board staff are visible via Zoom. Members of the public will be asked to unmute themselves when they are recognized to make public comment after the staff presentation. After the staff presentation, we will announce that the public comment period has opened. Staff will recognize any public attendee who has indicated they wish to speak. So how do you do that? On the Zoom video application, you're going to press the raise hand at the bottom of your screen so you can be recognized to speak. And at that point, you will be asked to unmute yourself. If you are participating by Zoom phone conference, please press *9 to raise your hand so that you can be recognized to speak. I will remind you all of this at the end of our presentation in case you've forgotten, but at that point, you'll press *9 to raise your hand. When you are recognized to speak, we will call the last 4 numbers of your phone number when it is your turn to speak. Remember to press *6 to mute or unmute yourself. In addition, you can send us written comments, email comments during the workshop at webcast@valleyair.org. I will be monitoring this mailbox during the workshop, and the comments received will be read aloud during the public comment period so we can recognize those comments. In addition, we are in the midst of an open public comment period. You're going to see an email address on the PowerPoint presentation, and it was in the public notice as well. So we welcome you to send in public comments at any time after this workshop as well as we continue working on this ozone plan. Some quick introductions before we get into the presentation. My name is Jessie Fierro, and I'm the Director of Air Quality Planning at the district. Presenting the workshop today are Patrick Houlihan. He is the Supervising Air Quality Specialist in the Planning Department, and Emily Nealon. She is a Senior Air Quality Specialist in the Planning Department. In addition, we're joined by several members of CARB staff, including Laura Carr, Air Pollution Specialist, and Jeremy Avis, the Chief of the Modeling and Meteorology Branch at the California Air Resources Board. So with those introductions out of the way, let's go on and start our presentation. James, if you could go on and show the PowerPoint, please. And Patrick, you will be kicking.
Yes.
And I should mention that the PowerPoint slides are indeed available on our webpage in the workshops part of our webpage, and you can go on and view the slide presentation, please. We have them available in both English and Spanish. With that, take it away, Patrick.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, let's discuss why we are here. In 2015, the EPA lowered the 8-hour annual ozone standard from 75 parts per billion, or ppb, down to 70 ppb. 3 years later, as required by the Federal Clean Air Act, the EPA officially designated the valley as non-attainment for the new standard. As a result, the district is required to adopt a new ozone plan, and the target date to do so is this year. You'll see through the remainder of the slideshow that through our strategies and CARB commitments, the Valley will meet the attainment goal by the required date of 2037. A majority of the plan has already been posted online, and the remaining sections will be posted in November to stay the course for the December public hearing for adoption. We are seeking public comment, as Jesse mentioned, and we ask that you submit those no later than November 9th, and you can do so through the email displayed at the end of the presentation. Go to the next slide. And on to slide 4, please. Okay, the district was formed in 1992, and since then we've adopted many rules to meet the federal mandates. Let's go back a slide. I think we passed up a slide. We missed slide 4. There we go. And excuse me, there's a fly in here driving me absolutely crazy. Okay, there we go. Back on track. The district was formed in 1992, and since we have adopted many rules to meet the federal mandates, a majority of those rules have been amended several times as technology advances and air quality standards are lowered. As indicated, the NOx is a key precursor to ozone, and NOx levels from all sources have declined over 75% since 1980. All right, on to slide 5, please. Thank you. Here we have the standards and attainment deadlines over the years, beginning with the 1997 standard of 84 ppb, then the 2008 standard of 75 ppb, and finally the latest standard of 70 ppb. The EPA meets every few years to consider new ozone standards to protect public health, and the 2015 standard represents the lowest standard to date. Next slide, please. Okay. Let me draw your attention to the graphic in the corner. The goal is to get to green or even better, dark blue. Later in the presentation, you'll see that CARB has a slide of a model that will, what the value will look like in 2037. Right now, this represents actual measured air quality or air monitoring data from the year 2000 to the year 2020. And you can see it indicates tremendous progress. It has taken several air quality plans to get to this level and onward into the future. Each plan builds upon the work of prior plans while adding unique new strategies to the ongoing effort. Along with those strategies, regulatory development, outreach, continued research, and incentive programs all conflate to improve the Valley's air quality. Next slide, please. Okay. The district would like to present some more actual air quality data. From the period of 2000 to 2004, Valley-wide, there were exceedances of the 70 ppb level between 150 and 190 times. In more recent years, this has dropped to around 100 exceedances each year. And also you can see several areas within the Valley have already achieved the 2015 standard, and we look forward to the entire Valley attaining the standard. Next slide, please. As mentioned, the district is required to adopt a new ozone plan, and we are calling it the 2022 Ozone Plan for the 2015 Ozone Standard. The Valley is designated as extreme non-attainment with an attainment deadline of 2037. And as stated, we will attain that goal as we have worked with many agencies to develop our plan. We will receive significant emissions reductions through control strategy, regulatory control measure commitments from CARB, and the district's own innovative further study measures. So they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but in this case, the blue trajectory line can be measured in pages. Over 4,000 pages of combined current and former air quality plans and rules. These are culminating into emissions reductions that will see the Valley attain the multiple ozone standards. As you can see, we're on our way to achieving the 1997 standard and progressing towards attainment of the 2008 and 2015 standards. At this time, I will turn the presentation over to Emily Nealon to discuss the plan elements.
Perfect. Thank you, Patrick, and thank you for having me here today. So now I will walk you through the different plan elements that are included in the draft 2022 Ozone Plan. Next slide, please. So this plan builds upon comprehensive strategies that are already in place from adopted district plans, which serve as the basis for this 2022 Ozone Plan. In particular, as you can see in this table, the District Governing Board has taken a number of recent regulatory actions that achieve ongoing emission reductions. And these regulations, coupled with recent actions from CARB, achieve a 62% reduction in NOx from 2017 through 2037. These adopted regulations will reduce emissions of NOx and VOCs as they're fully implemented in the upcoming years, which contributes to the Valley's attainment of the 2015 8-hour ozone standard. Next slide, please. Speaking of that existing control strategy, you can see here in the emissions inventory that reduction from our base year of 2017 through the attainment deadline of 2037. And as you can see in 2037 and in the prior years, the majority of emissions come from mobile sources, which highlights the importance of needed reductions from that category. Next slide, please. So as part of this 2022 Ozone Plan, the district conducted a robust control measure analysis for all NOx and VOC rules. The plan provides for implementation of all reasonably available control measures, or RACM, including implementation of reasonably available control technologies, or RACT. As part of this analysis, the district evaluated the applicability, requirements, and emissions inventories for all NOx and VOC rules. We analyzed state and federal regulations and other suggested guidance. We compared to analogous rules from other regions. We evaluated the technological and economical feasibility of any identified further control opportunities, evaluated each rule for a potential contingency measure, and presented the overall evaluation findings. And in summary, the district's analysis demonstrated that the vast majority of district rules currently require the most stringent measures feasible. Next slide, please. So this control measure analysis indicated that our district rules for leak detection and repair can be strengthened to include lower leak thresholds, more frequent LDAR inspections, use of new leak detection technologies, and other potential changes. The rule development process for these rules is currently in progress to be completed in 2023 or 2024. And importantly, although emission reductions from these measures are not needed to demonstrate attainment, the district is still including these measures as a SIP strengthening measure. Next slide, please. In addition to those regulatory commitments, in an effort to identify additional opportunities to strengthen the district's control measures and go beyond RACT requirements, we've identified a number of further studies for the categories of residential and commercial combustion, stationary combustion sources, energy and climate change programs, stationary source VOC measures, and other innovative measures for sources like lawn and garden equipment and locomotives. Many of these further studies will focus on advancing technology through the district's attainment year, potential incentive-based opportunities, in addition to evaluation of work currently being conducted by other agencies. Next, I will pass it over to Laura Carr from the California Air Resources Board to discuss CARB state SIP strategy for the Valley.
Thanks, Emily. I'm Laura Carr, an air pollution specialist at the California Air Resources Board in our Air Quality Planning and Science Division. And in the next few slides here, I'll be presenting the CARB measures in the 2022 state strategy for the state implementation plan, which is also called the 2022 state SIP strategy, which are included in the San Joaquin Valley 70 parts per billion ozone plan. Next slide, please. So first, I want to highlight that the 70 ppb 8-hour ozone standard is a challenge, not just for the San Joaquin Valley, but across the state, which we can see in this map here. The map shows all 19 non-attainment areas in the state and the current classifications, which are ranging from marginal non-attainment up to extreme non-attainment. There are still 10 areas in the state that need to develop SIPs for the 70 ppb ozone standard. The San Joaquin Valley and South Coast obviously have the most critical challenge here. They're the only two areas in the country which are currently classified as extreme non-attainment for the 70 ppb ozone standard. And just to further highlight the attainment challenge in the San Joaquin Valley, for the previous ozone standard, only a few areas statewide needed mobile source emission reduction commitments in order to be able to show attainment. But because the 70 ppb standard is so stringent, reductions from CARB's mobile source strategy are needed for 7 areas to be able to show attainment. So this is where the mobile source measures contained in the 2022 state SIP strategy come into play. Next slide, please. Last month, the CARB board approved the state measure commitments in the 2022 state SIP strategy, following a robust public process to develop the strategy. The 2022 state SIP strategy includes an unprecedented variety of new measures to reduce emissions from sources under our authority using all available mechanisms. This level of action is needed to ensure that all the air quality standards are attained and also to deliver on our commitments to protect public health. The 2022 state SIP strategy is aggressive and it drives the pace and the scale of CARB rulemakings, which will be taking place through the end of the decade. And for the San Joaquin Valley specifically, the strategy includes a commitment to reduce 23 tons per day of NOx emissions. Next slide, please. So this slide lists all of the CARB measures that are contained within the 2022 state SIP strategy. And we can see that the measures are grouped here by the category of sources that they address. So we have on-road mobile sources, off-road mobile sources which are primarily regulated by the federal government, and then other sources. So just a few things to highlight here. Some of these measures have already been adopted by the CARB board. Many are in the middle of their regulatory process. The CARB board is actually hearing the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation today, right now. We're developing new motorcycle standards, pursuing a whole suite of off-road measures, including a new off-road standard, zero emission requirements, and measures for sources that operate in ports. Our in-use locomotive regulation is innovative, and that will provide significant reductions in the San Joaquin Valley. And then in the other category there, we're also planning on amending the consumer products regulation, developing zero emission standards for space and water heaters. And then lastly, due to suggestions made by the public during the 2022 state SIP strategy development process, CARB included a pesticide measure targeting the pesticide 1,3-D. Next slide, please. Here we can see the same list of measures, this time with the schedule for board consideration and implementation of each item. The gold star on each row represents the year that the measure is scheduled to be brought to the board for consideration. And as you can see, most of the measures will be brought to the board within the next few years. And then following adoption, the dark blue squares represent the years which are planned for implementation to begin for each measure. Next slide, please. This table again shows the same measures, but this time it quantifies the emission reductions which are coming from implementation of this suite of measures in the San Joaquin Valley specifically. So the attainment deadline for the 70 parts per billion ozone standard in the Valley is 2037. And by 2037, CARB measures will provide 23 tons per day of NOx emission reductions and 2.5 tons per day of ROG emission reductions, reactive organic gases. We can see by looking at the numbers there for the NOx reductions that the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation provides a large portion of those reductions, 5.9 tons per day NOx. The Transport Refrigeration Unit regulation, Part 2, also provides significant reductions, 3.8 tons per day NOx. And then in addition, we can see significant reductions are needed from the federal locomotive regulation, which accounts for 11.2 tons per day NOx. Next slide. One other commitment, which is in the 2022 state SIP strategy that we want to highlight, is the pesticide measure. So the 2022 state SIP strategy includes a regulation from the California Department of Pesticide Regulation, or DPR, for 1,3-D. The regulation is currently under development by DPR, and it will address cancer and acute risk from the use of 1,3-D by shifting to application methods with lower 1,3-D emissions, or use other methods to reduce exposure. During the public process to develop the strategy and also during the hearing to adopt the strategy, the public advocated for a stronger pesticide measure. And at the hearing, CARB's board chair committed to update the 2022 state SIP strategy by quantifying 1,3-D emission reductions and also by more clearly stating CARB's authority around pesticides. And this update will occur in the CARB staff report that will be considered with the San Joaquin Valley 70 ppb ozone SIP in January 2023. Next slide, please. So turning now to next steps, like I just mentioned, in January 2023, the CARB board will consider adopting the San Joaquin Valley 70 ppb ozone SIP and the accompanying state emission reduction commitment for the San Joaquin Valley. And then after adoption, the SIP would be submitted to US EPA in early 2023 as a revision to the California SIP. And then, of course, the longer term process here over the next 15 years, CARB staff will continue developing the ambitious suite of measures that were listed on the previous slides, bringing those to the CARB board according to the schedule laid out and implementing them to provide the emission reductions which are needed for attainment of the 70 ppb ozone standard in the San Joaquin Valley and throughout the state. So with that, I will now hand it off to Jeremy Avis from the CARB modeling team to talk about the air quality modeling for the SIP.
Great, thanks, Laura. So as Laura said, my name is Jeremy Avis, and I oversee all of CARB's SIP modeling efforts. And what I'd like to do today is just spend some time talking about air quality modeling in general to give you a better idea and understanding of what goes into our SIP modeling efforts. So next slide. Okay, so there are three main components to an air quality modeling system, and I'll walk through these in a little more detail in the coming slides. So the first is emission inputs from both human activities and natural sources. And that also includes boundary conditions that represent the pollution that's in the air that is transported into California. So for example, pollution that's transported from Asia to the Western US. The second component is the meteorological model, which accounts for things like transport and dispersion of the emissions in the air. And the third component is what's typically thought of as the air quality model, and that's the representation of the chemistry and the physical processes that transform pollutant emissions into ozone. So next slide. Okay, so for emissions, we need to be as comprehensive as possible in terms of what emission sources are included for VOCs or ROG emissions, as well as for NOx sources. And so I've included some images of different sources that emit VOCs and NOx, and I'm not going to go through these one by one, but I did want to point out that the emissions that are included in our modeling analysis are not exact. And what I mean by that is we don't try to model emissions from individual cars or every time someone uses a consumer product. So instead, we have estimates of those emissions based on things like traffic flow for individual roads and how much of a given, say, product is sold in the San Joaquin Valley. Okay, next slide. All right, so typically the starting point for emissions are annual county total emissions for different categories. And then we need to process those emissions for use in our modeling. And so the first step is to put those emissions in the correct location within a county. So for example, if we're looking at emissions from, say, distribution centers, then we'll use information on the location of distribution centers within a county, and we'll use that to develop what we call a spatial surrogate. And that tells the modeling system where to place the emissions. Currently, we have over 100 different spatial surrogates that we use, and we go through a process of updating a number of those surrogates every year. Okay, next slide. All right, so the next step is to estimate hourly emissions from the annual emission estimates. And so we do this using what we call temporal profiles. And so the first step in this process is to estimate monthly activity. So what fraction of the annual emissions should be attributed to each month of the year. For this example of the monthly temporal profile on top there, you can see that most of the emissions are occurring in the summer months. And then next, we have to estimate how the emissions change from day to day during the week. And in this example, we're showing that daily activity is equal throughout the week, but it doesn't have to be the case. You could see day-to-day variability throughout the week. And lastly, we need to separate the daily emissions into hourly emissions. And in this example of the hourly profile, you can see that most of the emissions are occurring during the daytime, with the highest fractions in the afternoon. But again, all of these will be different for different emission categories. Okay, next slide. All right, so the last step in processing the emissions is converting the emissions into individual chemical species for modeling. And so we start with something like total VOC emissions, and we need to break that up into individual chemical species using what we call a speciation profile. And so here I'm showing an example speciation profile for gasoline vehicles. And you can see that roughly 27 or 28% of the VOC emissions are methane, with the rest of the chemical species accounting for smaller fractions of the total VOCs. And different sources, again, will have different speciation profiles. And so you'll see the size of those bars changing for different source categories. And currently we have over 1,000 unique VOC speciation profiles for different source categories that we use. Next slide. Okay, so now we also need to account for the pollution that's coming into California from outside its boundaries. And we do that using a global air quality model. So currently we're using a global model output from the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. But we have started doing our own in-house global modeling at CARB. And so we're hoping that for future SIPs, we'll be able to run our own global models for boundary conditions. Next slide. Okay, so the next component to the air quality modeling system is meteorology. And the meteorology used in the air quality modeling system comes from a regional weather model and accounts for all of the different processes shown in the cartoon image there on the slide. And you can think of this as similar to models that are used to provide a weather forecast. But since we're running the weather models for the past, we can actually tie them to observations, which makes them much more accurate than say, a typical weather forecast. Next slide. Okay, so the last component of the air quality modeling system is the chemistry and the physical processes that transform pollution in the atmosphere, which is represented by these 4 boxes on the top of the cartoon image there. And in this piece, this sort of is the component that really links everything together from the emissions on up. So on the right, I've shown a graphical representation of the chemistry that's being modeled, just as a way to illustrate the complexity of the modeling. So here, the red circles represent emissions, while the white circles represent all of the different chemical species that are formed in the atmosphere. And the blue lines represent different chemical reactions that are modeled. And we have equally complex mechanisms for modeling things like aerosol or particulate matter formation, cloud interactions with particles in the air, and the chemistry that takes place in clouds or fog. Next slide. Okay, so these 3 components are combined to form the air quality modeling system. And ultimately, that provides maps like the one on the right, which shows the modeled maximum daily average 8-hour ozone concentration. And so one thing I would like to point out is that the air quality modeling can only provide average air quality estimates over a given region. So our modeling is done over grids that are roughly 2.5 miles by 2.5 miles. So any differences in air quality from, say, neighborhood to neighborhood or near roadways will not be captured, which means that the pollution you as an individual are exposed to could be greater or less than what we model, depending on where you are in that region. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the way we use the modeling in the SIP is in a relative sense. So where we start with the observed ozone levels, which I'm showing as the DV 2018. And then we use the modeling to estimate how air quality will change as emissions are reduced, which is shown in the ratio on the right. So the modeled ozone 2037, which is our future ozone, divided by the modeled ozone 2018. And so we combine the model response on the right with the observations to estimate future air quality and attainment of the ozone standard on the left, which is the DV 2037. Okay, next slide. Okay, so on the last slide, I just wanted to summarize our modeling results from the ozone plan. And so from 2018 to 2037, we estimate that NOx emissions will be reduced by over 70%. While VOC emissions will be reduced to a lesser degree at around 10%. And there isn't time today to discuss the details of why it's more important to reduce NOx emissions compared to VOCs. But the science of ozone chemistry strongly supports NOx reductions over VOC reductions to get us to attainment. And a big part of that is because natural VOC emissions from plants are even greater than the emissions from human activities in the San Joaquin Valley. And we can't control those natural VOC emissions. So as long as there's enough NOx emissions, there will always be sufficient VOCs to form ozone, even if we controlled all of the VOCs from human activities. So the emission reductions are predicted to reduce ozone levels at the Fresno, Garland, and Clovis monitors to 68 ppb in 2037. And those are the monitors predicted to have the highest ozone levels in the future. And these estimates include impacts of wildfires on the observed ozone level. So in some ways, they're a worst case scenario. So on the bottom here, I've included a map of how ozone is predicted to change across the entire San Joaquin Valley from 2018 on the left to 2037 on the right. And so we're seeing a significant improvement in ozone air quality over the roughly 20-year period in all areas of the San Joaquin Valley, and all areas are showing essentially attainment at that point. And so that is the last slide I have. I'll hand it back to the Valley.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeremy. So as part of this plan, the Metropolitan Planning Organizations, or MPOs, for the 8 Valley counties conducted a robust transportation control measure analysis. And as a result of this analysis, the MPOs have identified new commitments to reduce vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, throughout the valley. And these measures fall under the categories of non-motorized use facilities, traffic flow improvements, transit improvements, and reduced single occupancy vehicle travel. And this analysis is presented in Appendix D of the plan. Next slide, please. The plan also provides for the offset of growth in emissions due to growth in vehicle miles traveled, again, VMT, through the implementation of transportation control strategies. In July of 2020, CARB submitted their 70 ppb ozone SIP submittal to EPA, which included the baseline emissions inventory and VMT emissions offset demonstration for the valley, so fulfilling this requirement for the plan. And ultimately, this demonstration shows that any growth in VMT through the attainment year is being offset by new measures. Next slide, please. So on the topic of mobile sources, the plan also includes a motor vehicle emissions budget, which we discussed in a previous workshop. In summary, the plan must include a budget that transportation planning agencies must conform to demonstrate that the emissions from their projects and plans conform with the SIP and will not impact the valley's progress toward attainment. And consistent with this requirement, CARB prepared the budgets in Appendix D of the draft plan, and this was in coordination with the Valley MPOs. Next slide, please. Under the Clean Air Act, the plan must show incremental progress towards the attainment year, meaning that the Valley can't simply get all reductions in 2037 or in 2036, but that progress needs to be made along the way. And in summary, the plan shows, specifically in this table, that we meet the required reductions for reactive organic gases, or ROG, and NOx in the milestone years. Specifically, this is 6 years after the base year, which is 2017, and every 3 years thereafter. Next slide, please. Lastly, for plan elements, the Clean Air Act requires that the plan provide for implementation of specific measures, also called contingency measures, if the area were to fail to attain or meet a milestone for reasonable further progress or attainment. And as many of you know, the interpretation of contingency measures has changed in recent years due to litigation. And contingency measures are extremely challenging for the Valley, along with other areas, because we face non-attainment challenges under multiple standards. And due to this, the Valley has to adopt all feasible measures in order to meet attainment. And in many cases, we are implementing the most stringent measures. So it's very difficult for us to hold any measures back. And also because of the severity of our non-attainment issues, as I mentioned, we've implemented the most stringent stationary and mobile source emissions requirements in the nation. Additionally, contingency measures are particularly challenging because they have to have what's called a contingency trigger, meaning that they're automatically implemented if a trigger happens, such as meeting an RFP milestone or failing to meet attainment. And unfortunately, this is not feasible for most control technologies, as they take time and planning to install and cannot be implemented as quickly as needed. And finally, the contingency measures, there's a scarcity of measures. So it's highly restrictive of the definition. So we have difficulty finding a measure that is that meets that definition. Therefore, the district is working collaboratively with CARB and South Coast to address contingency requirements, and we are awaiting needed guidance from EPA. Next slide, please. Lastly, the district wanted to highlight the extreme need for federal action on sources under their jurisdiction. The Clean Air Act is a system of cooperative federalism in which regions, states, and federal agencies must work together to improve air quality and public health. And as we previously discussed, the district and CARB have implemented the most stringent regulations for sources under our jurisdiction. However, given that standards are increasingly stringent for ozone and PM 2.5, additional NOx reductions are going to be needed from mobile sources under federal jurisdiction. Towards that end, the district has identified a number of critical opportunities for achieving significant additional emission reductions from mobile sources, including interstate heavy-duty trucks, locomotives, aircraft, and other mobile sources under EPA jurisdiction. Additionally, there's an unprecedented amount of funding opportunities through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act that could be utilized for reductions in the valley. The district and CARB will continue to call for federal action. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to be going over next steps for our planning process. Next slide. So obviously today we are having a public workshop, and following the workshop, we will be publishing the proposed plan for 30-day review in November ahead of a December governing board meeting. And following that, the district will submit the plan to EPA for inclusion in the SIP, which shows an attainment demonstration for 2037. Next slide, please. So the district has invited participation and comment throughout the public process for the development of the plan. And specifically, we've had numerous updates to the district governing board and citizens advisory committee, in addition to hosting multiple public workshops. And we continue to invite public participation and comment throughout the remainder of this public process. Next slide, please. So in May, we published initial draft plan sections. And most recently, we published the draft plan for review on October 14th, which we will be accepting public comments on until November 9th at 5 p.m. And you can submit your comments to airqualityplanning@valleyair.org. Next slide, please. If you have any questions, you can reach out to myself, Emily Nealand, using the contact information provided on the slide. And as always, we invite you to sign up for the district's listserv to receive updates on plan development and other district actions. And with that, I will open up for any comments or questions and pass it over to Jesse. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our presenters. We are now going to enter the public comment portion of our workshop. As I mentioned at the beginning, the way this will work is you can raise your hand. There should be a raise hand icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I don't believe we have any participants attending by phone, so I won't repeat those instructions. You can also email your comments to webcast@valleyair.org, and I will be monitoring that inbox as well. And so at this time, I will ask our staff to call on the first commenter.
Our first comment is from Jane.
Thank you. Go ahead, Jane.
Hi, Jane Sellon, co-director of the statewide coalition Californians for Pesticide Reform. We're based in Lindsay, California, in the heart of the San Joaquin Valley. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. We appreciate the inclusion of the carcinogenic fumigant pesticide 1,3-dichloropropene in the draft SIP. Inclusion of pesticide VOC emissions is a critical public health and environmental justice issue. And we strongly believe that any emissions reduction planning for the San Joaquin Valley, including this SIP, must address this significant source of air pollution. However, the inclusion of 1,3D rulemaking is not enough without an ambitious emissions reduction target for this pesticide. So we urge the district and CARB to take the opportunity to set a health protective air quality context for DPR's ongoing 1,3D rulemaking. We understand from CARB and DPR staff that the ozone SIP will be NOx limited because of the changed chemistry in the San Joaquin Valley since the 1994 SIP. We note, however, that for the purposes of permitting stationary sources, the San Joaquin Valley Air District still relies on District Rule 2201, which lists VOCs and NOx as ozone precursors and requires industrial sources to limit both. I'm sure it would be news to industry that VOC emissions are not relevant to ozone formation in the valley. So we'd really appreciate a response to the question, why does the NOx limited argument not also apply to stationary sources? And indeed, in Chapter 3 of the draft SIP, the district acknowledges CARB's assessment that the valley is NOx limited, but pledges to reduce VOCs anyway, at least in the stationary source and consumer product sectors. But CARB and the district will make no such commitment when it comes to agricultural pesticides. Why? Second, although we have not focused on PM 2.5 because of our coalition's singular focus on pesticides, we understand from our allies that the US EPA is proposing to reject the state's 2012 PM 2.5 National Ambient Air Quality Standards SIP, in part because of its failure to fully analyze ammonia emissions as a PM 2.5 precursor, making a similar NOx limited claim. it's imperative that the district not simply write off an entire class of hazardous pollutants, such as pesticide VOCs, and we certainly hope the US EPA feels the same way. Finally, although it's up to CARB and not the district to acknowledge CARB's authority to regulate pesticide toxic air contaminants once they volatilize in the air, we believe the district's SIP as drafted actually misstates or at best oversimplifies DPR's authority in Chapter 3, page 28, and fails to acknowledge CARB's overlapping authority. So we urge you to fix or remove this inaccurate and incomplete language. Thank you again for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you. Next commenter.
Our next comment is from Michelle.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Hi, thank you. My name is Michelle Correa Ryan, and I live and work in Stanislaus County. I work as a family nurse practitioner and nurse educator, and I'm part of the California Nurses for Environmental Health and Justice. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak at this workshop and speaking to the inclusion of pesticides in the 1,3-D. Pesticides are heavily used in the San Joaquin Valley. We know that some of these pesticides cause health problems like cancer, autism, and premature birth. We also know that many pesticides contain reactive organic gases that lead to ozone pollution in our air. Ozone pollution is worse in our valley than most anywhere else in the country. So you can hear that people in our valley are being impacted from birth to death, basically, by these substances. And we are not clear on what the targets are to reduce emissions of 1,3-D, and we're not sure why we're not going to see the inclusion of these until January, why there won't be in earlier editions, so we can take a look at what that is. And we thank you. We want to thank you for including the dichloropropene, and we would also like you to really think about the reactive organic gases, or the ORGs, also when you're talking about these reduction targets for pesticides. Thank you.
Thank you. Next comment, please.
Next is Jasmine.
Go ahead, Jasmine.
Good evening. I'm Jasmine Martinez, a Kern County resident and coalition coordinator with the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition. According to the American Lung Association State of the Air report, 3 Valley cities rank among the top 5 most polluted in the nation for ozone pollution, contributing to the highest asthma rates in the state. As I did in this presentation, addressing NOx and VOCs is essential to changing this reality. The oil and gas industry continues to be one of our most current underregulated sources in the valley, and Kern County is home to 4 of the nation's top 7 producing oil fields, with over 40,000 oil wells responsible for 75% of California's onshore oil and gas production. According to EPA's projection of its national emissions inventory, over 20,000 tons of VOCs will be emitted by oil and gas facilities from California facilities in 2025, with a projection of more than 12,000 summertime asthma attacks in children under the age of 18 due to ozone smog resulting from oil and gas pollution. Our coalition has been engaged in the district's leak detection and repair, or LDAR, rulemaking that started in 2020, and have advocated for the strongest measures to protect Valley residents living near these facilities from avoidable emissions. In a comment letter last year, we asked for several ways to improve the LDAR rules and have yet to receive any updates on the rulemaking since March this year. Adopting some of these recommendations, which included decreasing the repair timeframes, having frequent unannounced inspections, using community science as complementary to district data, and ceasing facility operations when leaking does occur, are only one piece of the puzzle in improving how we address ozone in San Joaquin Valley. And this plan must do more to adopt and enforce more ambitious measures to reduce emissions focused on our largest and oldest stationary sources. A significant source mentioned earlier this evening is pesticides. We must go further and set emission reduction targets that align with the priority concern that communities have shared for decades. This is most evident in our AB 617 communities, which have urged for notification systems, buffer zones, and reductions. The Valley Ozone Plan should be seen as an opportunity to address gaps in the community air protection program while supporting much needed emission reductions to get to the ozone standard. Thank you.
Thank you. Next commenter, please.
Next is Mark.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mark.
Hello, my name is Mark Rose, and I am the Sierra Nevada Program Manager for National Parks Conservation Association. I want to start by just thanking Valley Air District and CARB staff for today's presentation. Unfortunately, though, it really did nothing to assuage my continued extreme concern that this proposed strategy to meet the 2037 70 parts per billion ozone standard will ultimately fail to reach attainment. My concern is really based on your agency's long track record of consistently failing to meet existing Clean Air Act standards for both ozone and PM 2.5. For instance, at the end of 2020, the Valley once again failed to meet a quarter-century-old MAC standard for PM 2.5 from 1997. Earlier this year, you had major portions of your state SIP for the 2006 PM 2.5 standard thrown out in federal court. And just today, both CARB and the Valley Air District sent EPA a letter requesting that you pull a now 4-year-old plan to meet the 2012 PM 2.5 standard, following years of mismanagement and obvious planning failures that resulted in EPA's recent proposal to reject that plan. Forgive me if this record does not give me much faith in the plan that you put forth today. Nothing exemplifies my concerns with this plan more than the fact that we now have 15 years to meet this updated standard by 2037. And yet the Valley Air District is proposing to do basically nothing to strengthen its rules or develop additional new control measures leading up to this attainment date. Instead, once again, just as you did with the PM 2.5 plans, the Valley Air District is pointing to their existing suite of inadequate measures as your only real contribution to the plan, with CARB yet again bearing the full burden of developing new measures. While we do support your minimal efforts to strengthen leak detection and repair, it is short of the bare minimum of what the district should be doing to improve the air in one of the most polluted air zones in the nation. While we have provided a clear roadmap to agencies time and time again, showing that there are numerous feasible control measures that could be adopted to decarbonize residential, commercial, and industrial sources and reduce NOx and VOC emissions, the district's plans merely states that they will analyze additional controls as areas of additional study. With 15 years to meet this standard is not good enough to merely study whether you could enact new feasible control measures sometime in the future. This must be included in the plan and implemented prior to the 2037 attainment date. Thank you.
Thank you. Next commenter, please.
Next, we have Cynthia.
Go ahead, Cynthia.
Hi, hello, Cynthia Pinto Cabrera with the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition, policy coordinator, and also a Madera County resident. And, just wanted to echo a lot of the comments that are being said today, especially about pesticides and the oil and gas pieces that my colleagues mentioned, but wanted to speak a little bit more about the rules that Mark just mentioned. CVAC has been really engaged in all of the rulemaking processes for the Valley Air District, and we continue to see so many loopholes that honestly just show a prioritization of profits over people. And that, again, does not, like Mark mentioned, does not spark much confidence in our ability to meet these standards coming up. So that's just a few comments that I had to make, but I also had a few questions as well. So first off, when it comes to the precursors for VOCs, I was wondering if we could get that analysis for VOCs, and we have some questions if it included ammonia for PM 2.5. We want to kind of dive into that analysis ourselves and look at it. And then I had another question when it comes to ERCs. In the ERCs appendices, it mentioned that the district expects that some pre-baseline credits will be used to mitigate growth. Given the history with the ERCs, the ERC credits that CARB found were overcredited and invalid, how will you all make sure that the credits being used for this plan are not those that are overvalued and invalid? Because it honestly just does not spark, again, a lot of confidence in the use of ERCs in this plan as well. So those are some comments and some questions. If you can answer them, that'd be great, but can also follow up offline. Thanks.
Thank you for your comments. Next commenter, please.
Next comment is from Jane.
Go ahead, Jane.
Hello, is this?
Oh, hi, you are labeled as Jane.
Yeah, no, definitely not Jane.
You don't
Angel
sound like Jane.
Garcia. Yes. Well, first of all, good afternoon. Name is Angel Garcia, born and raised, and I live and work in Tulare County. I'm a co-director of the statewide coalition, Californians for Pesticide Reform, and I first want to thank you for the opportunity to comment this afternoon. There is very little air monitoring for pesticides in Tulare County, but based on data California has collected about the quantities of pesticides used in Tulare and other San Joaquin Valley counties, my family, my neighbors, and I are likely exposed to pesticide air pollution regularly. We are concerned about how this pollution impacts our health, and we are also concerned about how reactive organic gases and pesticides make ozone pollution in the valley worse. Thank you for including the pesticide 1,3-dichloropropene in the draft's ZIP, but we are particularly concerned about this pesticide because it is a reactive organic gas, causes cancer, and has been measured at high levels in the air at both of the San Joaquin monitors, Shafter in Kern County and the one in Parlier and Fresno County. The SIP is incomplete in the way it includes 1,3-D, however, and at this point, 1,3-D emission reductions are unquantified. The district must set an ambitious reduction target to protect Valley residents. We also know that many pesticides besides 1,3-D make or contain reactive organic gases, and the air district must set ambitious reduction targets for those pesticides as well, strengthening the language in earlier SIPs. And finally, the SIP must clearly state that the air district has authority to regulate emissions of toxic air contaminants in the valley. The following language has been used in the past, and I quote, DPR has regulatory authority over pesticide in their pesticide use. Some pesticides are also classified as toxic air contaminants and so can be regulated as a toxic air contaminant and as smog forming compounds as they become waste gases outside of their pesticidal use. State law establishes a system of overlapping authorities between pesticide and air regulators to address these complex problems. End of quote. With that, I'd like to conclude and thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Angel. Next commenter, please.
Next is Perry.
Hello, I'm Perry Ellerts with Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. To meet the Clean Air Act goals for ozone pollution, the Valley Air District should look to improve the Valley District's Rule 9510, or referred to as the Indirect Source Rule. It should be updated to focus on maximizing the emission reductions in disadvantaged communities disproportionately affected by pollution associated with warehouses and distribution centers. The South Coast Rule in some instances goes far beyond the Valley's rule, and the Valley should look to update its rule to capture additional emissions. The Air District should also look to implement a new innovative ISR rule that covers dairies, agricultural emissions, and potentially pesticides. And in regards to pesticides, communities have made it clear that pesticides are a priority source of pollution concern and that the Air District needs to adopt regulations and conduct monitoring to better control emissions from pesticides, including and beyond that of 1,3-D. The SIP should also explore regulations to control fertilizer emissions And lastly, this plan needs to incentivize public transportation and bike accessibility as alternate modes of transportation. I thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you. Any additional comments?
We do not have any additional, oh, we do have an additional comment from Cynthia.
Go ahead, please.
Hi, just wanted to follow up. Are we not answering questions during this workshop? Or are you guys noting them down to be followed up later? Just kind of curious, since we did have some questions about wanting to look at that VOC analysis and
Sure.
the ERC's piece of it.
Sure. I think for now, we will note that there is extensive information on both of those topics in the plan and the specific appendices. If you look to Appendix F, which is the modeling protocol and attainment demonstration, that has a lot of information about the VOC issues, the NOx limited issues. And then Appendix I on emission reductions credits also addresses the topic that you raised earlier. For further discussion, we're happy to talk to you offline. We wanted to make sure we preserved as much time as possible for public comments while ending the workshop on time for the EJAG meeting that's this evening. So Cynthia, I'd be happy to talk to you later on this week. Thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
Seeing no other comments in the webcast or on the participant list, we will go on and close our workshop. So again, we thank you all for taking the time to join us today and provide us comments. And that concludes our workshop.